In the last couple of videos, we examined one version of colour realism, colour reductionism. This is the claim that colours are reducible to physical properties. Most plausibly, colours are reducible to surface spectral reflectances. Now, this view faces a number of problems. One of the main objections is that physical properties lack some necessary feature of colour. For instance, spectral reflectances can't be divided into unique and binary hues, or they don't match the relations of similarities between colours, and so on. Now, one view that solves all of these problems is primitivism, because primitivism says that colours are exactly as they appear. The nature of colours is revealed in colour experience. So we perceive colours as having a distinction between unique and binary hues, and that's exactly what colours have, according to primitivists. Similarly, we perceive colours as having a certain degree of saturation. We perceive them as having opponent relations. We perceive them as having certain relations of similarity. Primitivism says colours have the properties they appear to have. They are exactly as they appear to be. Now, one consequence of this is that colours are irreducible. A colour can't be identified with anything else. Redness is not a wavelength. It's not a surface spectral reflectance. Red is just red. When you open your eyes and look at a red cup, you're seeing a colour as it really is. The nature of colour is fully revealed in your perception. Obviously, we don't perceive colours as being wavelengths, for instance. We don't perceive them as being surface spectral reflectances, so that's not what they are. They are just, they are exactly as they appear. So colours are not physical properties. They are somehow over and above the physical properties. And actually, they're not just over and above physical properties. The point of primitivism is that colours can't be identified with anything else. So not only are colours not physical properties, they are not to be identified with other kinds of non-physical properties either. Colours are simple, irreducible properties. Okay, they can't be reduced to anything else. Now, primitivism is an objectivist or realist view. Like colour reductionism, primitivism claims that colours are mind-independent and they're also non-relational. So they're intrinsic properties of objects. They don't depend on the relation between an object and a perceiver, or the relation between an object and its surroundings. Now, of course, certain surroundings may be necessary in order to best perceive a colour. For instance, in order to see brownness or brown, that requires having certain surroundings, as we discussed in the last video. But the colour itself exists as an intrinsic property of the object. So, this tells us what colours are not, but what exactly are they more positively? And this is somewhat difficult to say. I think that we can best understand what the primitivists might be saying by considering how they respond to one of the main objections to primitivism. C.L. Hardin points out that there's a bit of a problem accounting for causality on the primitivist view. The primitivist faces a dilemma. Either colours are connected to other physical properties of objects, or they aren't. Now, if they are connected to physical properties, they must have physical effects, and we ought to be able to test for them by physical means. In other words, if colours are connected to physical properties, then insofar as physical theory makes no mention of colour, physical theory is deficient. Okay? If colours have physical effects, then we would expect that physicists and other scientists are postulating colours to explain various physical phenomena. So if colours are connected to physical properties, it looks like physical theory is deficient. But this seems very unlikely. We have a pretty good story of the causes of colour sensations. We're very foggy about how colour is processed in the brain, but in terms of the processes going on in the external world that cause colour, we actually know those very well. Just go back and watch the first video in this series. We understand wavelengths of light. We know what light is and how it's produced. We understand how light interacts in different ways with different objects. We can measure spectral reflectances and so on. So if colours are connected to physical properties, why does physics seem to provide a fairly complete story of the production of colour sensations? I mean, it looks like, well, it's very unlikely that that physics is just missing this very important part of the story. On the other hand, if colours are not connected to physical properties, then they can't play any role in determining what wavelengths of light are reflected from or emitted from or transmitted through a physical object. So if colours are not connected to physical properties, they can't play any role in determining what wavelengths of light arrive at our eyes, which would mean that they make no difference to our perceptual data, because ultimately the only way that we can perceive colours is by our photoreceptors being stimulated by photons. I mean, well, we can hallucinate colours as well, but obviously that wouldn't be perception, technically speaking. So if colours have no connection to physical properties, then there's no means by which they could affect our perceptual systems. We would have no connection to colours, and then that looks like we're forced to be anti-realists, or at least we're forced to a very sceptical position, where you know, even if we say that colours exist out there in the external world, we could have no connection to them. So this is the dilemma that faces anybody who wants to say that colours are non-physical properties, that colours are over and above the physical properties. How can we respond? Well, the usual response to this is to treat colours as a kind of higher level or emergent property. And what do we mean by emergent property? So obviously there must be some sort of connection between colours and physical properties. Now, to say that colour is an emergent property is to say that colour is in some sense constituted out of physical properties, but is nevertheless not identical to or reducible to them. So, how does this work? Well, by analogy, maybe you could consider functionalism in the philosophy of mind. According to most functionalists, every mental state is realised by or constituted by certain physical states. For instance, in humans, pain is the firing of C fibres. Whenever your C fibres fire, you will experience pain. Actually, that example is incorrect as a matter of neurobiology. Pain is very complex, involves all sorts of different processes, but this is the toy example that you see in philosophy articles, and it illustrates the point. So let's say pain in humans is the firing of C fibres. Now, presumably, pain can't be identified with the firing of C fibres because various things that don't have C fibres could experience pain. So perhaps one day we'll build a robot that could experience pain, but the robot would be made of silicon chips and transistors, not neurons and C fibres. So functionalism suggests instead that pain is identified by its causal role. Certain stimulations typically cause pain, and certain behaviours are typically produced by pain. So pain is typically caused by bodily damage and typically causes distress and attempts to alleviate the pain. Anything that has this causal profile is a pain. Any inner state that is caused by bodily damage and causes distress and attempts to alleviate it is a pain. In humans, that's the firing of C fibres. So in humans, the firing of C fibres is caused by bodily damage and causes distress and attempts to alleviate the firing of C fibres. But in robots, it would be some state of the transistors and silicon chips. Okay, so in robots there would be bodily damage, and that would cause a certain state in the transistors and silicon chips, and then that state would have various other causes and effects. So, so the point is that pain is not identified with a physical state. Instead, it's identified with a certain causal role. And so although every pain is realised by certain physical processes, pain isn't identical to any particular physical process. Okay, C fibres are physical, silicon chips and transistors are physical, but we can't reduce pain to any particular physical property. Pain is, in this sense, something over and above the physical properties. Every pain is constituted by physical properties, but nevertheless, pain is something that is over and above them. This maybe isn't the best analogy because the functionalist is still a reductionist of sorts. The functionalist reduces pain to a state with a certain causal profile. The colour primitivist, as we have said, doesn't want to reduce colour to anything else. Colours are primitive. They are irreducible. But perhaps this can give us a sense of the relation between colours and physical properties according to the colour primitivist. So that the functionalist says, the point here is that the functionalist says that pain is constituted by physical states such as C fibres firing or certain states of silicon chips and transistors, but it is not reducible to either one of them, because of course it can be both. Perhaps another example are genes. We identify genes by considering patterns of inheritance of biological traits. Now, the underlying physical basis is sequences of DNA, but arguably genes can't be identified with sequences of DNA. There are many arguments here, let me mention just a couple. DNA sequences have coding regions, which are known as exons, but also non-coding regions, known as introns. Introns don't code for proteins. When the DNA sequence is transcribed into RNA, introns are spliced out. Now, there's a phenomenon known as alternative splicing, and this occurs when the DNA sequence can have exons spliced out as well. So the same DNA sequence can produce different sequences of RNA, giving rise to very different proteins. One splicing might leave you with all of the exons, another splicing might remove 2 of the exons when the introns are removed. And these are not errors. Alternative splicing is a widespread and important part of the genome. And there are various other processes of RNA modification. When the RNA is translated into protein, there are various processes of protein modification as well. So when we look at what's going on the molecular level, it turns out there's this huge variety of very complex processes, and arguably it is too much of a simplification to say that a gene is just a DNA sequence. Arguably genes emerge at a higher level. We can only identify genes by looking at the entire organism and its ancestors and descendants. This is obviously controversial. It's a big issue in philosophy of biology, but the point of the analogy is just to illustrate how emergent properties might work. So again, genes, although they are constituted by physical processes, they are not reducible to any particular physical state or physical process. Now, a crucial idea for emergence is supervenience. Emergent properties supervene on physical properties. Mental states supervene on neural states. Colours, we might say, supervene on spectral reflectances and wavelengths of light. Now, we say that A properties are supervenient on B properties when you can't change the A properties without changing the B properties. So, you can't alter the mental state without altering the underlying physical state. In other words, if the two physical states are the same, the mental state will be the same. In the same way, you can't alter the colour without altering the physical processes. If the underlying physical processes are exactly the same, if you've got exactly the same spectral reflectance in exactly the same context, then the colour is the same. The two objects with the same spectral reflectance, that interact with light in the same way, those two objects must have the same colour. So this maybe provides the answer to Hardin's dilemma. Colours are connected to physical properties. Indeed, colours are, like everything else in the world, constituted by purely physical properties. But it doesn't follow that colours are reducible to or identical with physical properties. Furthermore, colours are not detectable at the purely physical level, and this is why we can't expect physics to make any mention of colours. It's not that physics is deficient, it's just that colours are not detectable at the level physics deals with. When we focus our attention exclusively on physical properties, we don't find any colours there. We shouldn't be surprised about this because the same is true for many other properties, such as mental states and genes. We can't test for the presence of genes by just looking at sequences of DNA or other processes in the cell. We have to consider a wider context, the context of the whole organism and how traits of the organism relate to traits of its ancestors and descendants, and then link that to what's going on at the molecular level. So In the same way we can't test for the presence of colours by examining wavelengths and spectral reflectances. And again, we can't test for mental states by just looking at neural behaviour. Again, this is something we have to look at perhaps the whole organism. So these properties emerge at a higher level, constituted out of physical properties and supervene on physical properties, but they are not reducible to them or identical with them. So perhaps this answers the dilemma posed by Hardin, but a question about causality still remains. And this objection was presented by Jae-Won Kim in his downward causation argument. So Kim's argument is really an argument against emergent properties in general, but obviously if we're construing colours as emergent properties, then this is an argument against primitivism. So let's be very clear about how emergent properties are supposed to work. We have physical properties, call them P, and these higher level emergent properties, call them E. The physical properties are properties such as mass, charge, spin, and so on. The higher level properties might be colours or mental states or genes or whatever. Now the emergentist makes three claims. First, that E supervenes on P. Second, that E is irreducible to P, so E is something over and above P. And finally, that E has distinctive causal powers. Right? E isn't just an epiphenomenon. It can cause things. It has causes and effects. Now Kim's argument is that this picture is unsustainable. Suppose we say that some higher level event causes another higher level event. So E causes E star. For example, we might suggest that the redness of the cup causes me to experience a red sensation when I look at the cup. That's surely a claim that the primitivist would want to make. Colours cause colour sensations. That seems obvious. So we might diagram the situation like this. These red lines here show the relation of supervenience. The green line shows causation. We have these physical properties or physical events P and P star, and these are the subvenient bases of the supervenient emergent properties E, or emergent events E and E star, and E causes E star. Now the first claim then is that colours supervene on some lower level physical properties. But in that case, the only way for E to cause E star is for E to cause P star. Right? To bring about an emergent property, you need to bring about the base physical properties from which it emerges. So something like this. So if you want to bring about a certain mental state, you need to bring about the underlying neural states. In order for a colour to cause, say, a sensation of the colour, that colour must cause certain underlying neural states. Basically, E must exhibit downward causation. So the colour must cause the lower level brain properties that underlie the higher level sensation. So that's fairly clear, I hope. Now here's the problem. E itself supervenes on some other lower level properties P. Colour supervenes on wavelengths of light or spectral reflectances or whatever. But then it would seem to follow that P alone is sufficient to cause P star, like this. And this is kind of obvious when you think about it. We can tell a complete story of the production of colour experiences using only the physical properties. The spectral reflectance of the object, combined with the wavelength of the illuminant, leads the object to reflect certain wavelengths of light. These wavelengths of light hit the photoreceptors in the retina, and the experience of colour is produced by internal processes from there. What explains the experience of colours are the physical properties such as wavelength and reflectance, not the higher level properties. It looks like the physical properties alone are sufficient. There's no causal work left for this higher level property to do. So basically Kim's challenge is as follows. The defender of colour primitivism needs E to be a cause of P star, but P threatens to preempt E,
as a cause of P star. And this is, of course, an argument against all emergent properties. If the primitivist conceives of colour as an emergent property, which seems to be the only plausible way of developing primitivism, then the primitivist faces this objection. So that's a pretty serious problem. Now, one response here, not exactly a direct response, but perhaps this can take some of the heat off the primitivist, and this is from Michael Watkins, is that it's actually not just the colour primitivist who faces difficulties accounting for causality. In fact, colour reductionism has just as much trouble when it comes to causal relations. Now, this is because colour reductionism is only plausible as a disjunctive claim. We saw in I think the first video on reductionism that in order to respond to the metamerism problem, reductionism has to treat colours as sets of spectral reflectances that are pretty much arbitrary from a physical point of view. Colours are therefore disjunctive properties. But it's very difficult to explain how disjunctive properties can be causally efficacious. So take redness. Redness is the set of reflectances A or B or C or D, etc. Redness is the name of this whole disjunctive property. So the problem is, if an object is A, it will look red. If an object is B, it will look red. If an object is C, it will look red, and so on. But now, how can the disjunctive property of redness have any causal powers of its own? The causal powers of redness are simply the causal powers of each of its disjuncts. So let's take a specific example. Suppose I'm looking at a cup. The cup looks red. Why does it look red? Well, surely because of its surface spectral reflectance. It has reflectance D, say. Now, D is part of the disjunctive property redness, but it seems pretty clear that what's doing the causal work is D alone. It's not it's not A or B or C or D or etc. that's doing the causal work. It's just D. Maybe another way to see this problem is to note how easy it is to generate disjunctive properties. So let's say that the disjunctive property Z is constructed out of having having spectral reflectance D and being a supergiant star in the Andromeda galaxy. Anything that either has spectral reflectance D or is a supergiant star in the Andromeda galaxy has the property Z. Surely it's obvious that Z doesn't have any causal powers of its own. What has the causal power is having spectral reflectance D or it's being a supergiant star in the Andromeda galaxy. But Z clearly doesn't have any causal powers. So Watkins says it's not legitimate to attack primitivism for problems accounting for causality because the only plausible reductionist option faces the same problem. This is basically the same problem as Kim's argument, if we imagine that disjunctive properties are higher level properties. So this is essentially the same kind of problem. Now, of course, the fact that both primitivism and reductionism face this problem is perhaps a reason not to defend primitivism, but to reject both primitivism and reductionism. From the anti-realist point of view, Watkins has simply pointed out a good reason not to be a colour realist. But Watkins's point, of course, is that if we are attracted to colour realism, primitivism is no worse off as far as causal powers are concerned. Still, the primitivist may want to address Kim's argument more directly. Now, Kim's argument has generated an enormous amount of literature in philosophy, and it really need a whole series to deal with it. I'd love to look at some of the responses and the attempts to save emergent properties, but it really is just a big tangent for this video. One day I'll do a series on it. If you're interested in any of the literature, please send me a message and I'll send you a bunch of papers. Although I am actually very bad at keeping up with messages, but if I see it, I'll respond. So I don't really want to go into that tangent here. If you're interested, as I say, I will send you something, but I don't want this to become a series on emergence. One thing I did want to mention, though, is that I think a serious problem here, even if we can answer Kim's argument and so make room for emergent properties, the question remains of why exactly we should believe that colours are these emergent properties. Why should we believe that colours have this status?
when we consider other supposed emergent or higher level states, such as mental states or genes, we see that these have measurable physical effects, we can test for them, and we sort of have to appeal to them in the sciences. They seem to be indispensable to scientific practice and to everyday life. So with genes, well, we need them to explain patterns of inheritance of phenotypic characteristics, and there are various ways of testing to what degree genes influence a trait versus the influence from the environment, and so on. With mental states, well, obviously we need those to explain behaviour, and positing mental states in psychology and cognitive science has been extremely useful for shedding light on our inner workings. So we seem to have pretty good reason to believe in mental states and genes, and that's why emergence needs to be accounted for, assuming that mental states and genes are emergent properties. Now, the question is, how do we test for colours? Where do colours fit in the sciences? Emergent properties are a problem because we have good reason to believe in them, because they're supported by empirical evidence. That's what makes emergence a challenge. Now, if there were no reason to believe in mental states or genes, we would simply stop believing in them. We would eliminate them from our theories. And indeed, there are philosophers who have proposed that mental states and genes don't exist and should be eliminated. That's obviously a minority position. But prima facie, this is the position we're in with respect to colour. Most colour scientists are anti-realists about colour, and it's unclear to me that there is this sort of empirical need to postulate colours. It looks to me like we just don't need them. So even if we can make room for emergent properties, why would we suppose that colour is one of these emergent properties? Okay, so that was the problem arising from causality for primitivism. A second objection to primitivism is that it faces a skeptical problem. How can we know whether we are accurately perceiving colours? The trouble is that if colours are not physical properties, there's no way to check them. One example here, and I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly who gave this example. I think it might have been John Campbell. Appeals to a bike. We look at the wheels of a bike and they appear circular. We move around the bike and we look at them from different angles and we still judge them to be circular. But how do we know that our visual perception is accurate? How do I know that I'm not hallucinating and the wheels are actually triangular? Well, one option is simply try to ride the bike. If you can ride it easily, they're probably not triangular wheels, because triangular wheels wouldn't ride very easily. Now, of course, this doesn't absolutely prove that the wheels are circular. If you've read Descartes, you might think that maybe all of our senses could be completely mistaken. But the point is that with shape, we can test the deliverances of vision in various ways. For instance, by testing what we see against other sensory modalities. What about the question, how do I know that the bike is red and not white? Well, notice that if we identify colours with physical properties, as the reductionist does, this is no problem. Redness is a set of spectral reflectances, so to check whether the bike is really red, we analyse the surface spectral reflectance of the bike. But what can we turn to on primitivism? Since colours are not physical properties, it looks like there just is nothing to check. Now, one response to this might be to say, well, first, we can apply radical skepticism to anything. Yes, we can't check colour perceptions against other sensory modalities, but in general, we have to assume that perception provides an accurate picture of the world. We have to assume that because if we drop that assumption, we simply wouldn't be able to trust perception at all anymore. Yeah, but given the assumption that perception is generally reliable, we have every reason to believe that we accurately see colours. Perception is generally accurate, and perception shows us a world full of colour. More significantly, there are in fact ways of checking whether our colour perceptions are accurate, and this is because we know the circumstances in which colour illusions can occur, and we can identify colour illusions fairly easily. For instance, we know what produces afterimages. It's when the cells become fatigued, as we explained in the first video. Or, to frame it in a more everyday sense, it's when we stare at a particular image for a long period of time. If we stare at something for a long time, that will produce an after image of what we have seen. And so we can also easily identify after images. If after looking at a red circle you see a greenish circle that follows the movements of your eyes, that's a pretty good sign that it's an illusion. The greenish circle doesn't exist out there in the world, it's just something that is just a product of your perceptual system. And of course there are other methods. For instance, if you're wondering whether your perceptions are accurate, you could just ask other people. If we're not sure of what the colour of an object is, we can check our own perceptions against the perceptions of others. So in fact, there are ways of checking our colour perception. We can't, the methods are not quite the same as the methods with shape, but that's no surprise at all. Colour is not the same as shape. So we do have methods of checking whether we are under an illusion or whether we are perceiving things accurately. Now, the main thing here is that I think this argument perhaps misses the real point of the real force of the skeptical objection. I mean, this kind of argument explains how to identify local illusions, illusions in particular cases like afterimages, but arguably it doesn't really help with the possibility of global illusion. So let's assume that primitivism is true. The real skeptical problem is that there are a number of different theories of the relation between colours and colour experiences. So let's take two hypotheses about how colour relates to colour experiences. The obvious theory is that red causes sensations of red, green causes sensations of green, blue causes sensations of blue, and so on. In other words, our colour perceptions are veridical. So now consider an alternative, some sort of spectrum inversion. For instance, red causes the experience of green, blue causes the experience of yellow. How can we rule this out? I mean, given primitivism, this hypothesis seems just as reasonable as the theory that our experiences are veridical. To see the problem, let's contrast this with what the reductionist might say. This is an image of a jazz musician, Pharoah Sanders. Now, so this is how you see Pharoah Sanders when you look at him, when you look at this image. This is how the image looks to you. But perhaps another person sees the image like this. Now, the reductionist says that colours are spectral reflectances. Obviously, we're not perceptually aware that we're looking at spectral reflectances. The nature of colour is not revealed in the colour experience. So the reductionist says that this is a sensation of sort of reddish-orange, and also this is a sensation of reddish-orange. Both of these individuals, the person who sees things this way and the person who sees things this way, are seeing red. It's just that red presents itself differently for each individual. Provided we both make the same colour discriminations, we can both claim to see the same colour, though we might see them in different ways. This kind of inversion is not a problem because the real nature of colours is hidden from us anyway. But the primitivist says that colours just are as they appear. The primitivist isn't entitled to the response that we're seeing colours in different ways, because if we're seeing it in different ways, then one of us must be massively mistaken about colour. So, let's say that this is redness. Okay, so the person who sees things this way is accurately seeing redness. Well, then the person who sees things this way is in the grip of an illusion, a serious illusion. The skeptical problem for primitivism is that it looks like we have no way of choosing between the hypothesis that colour experience is veridical and the hypothesis that we're all under some sort of spectrum inversion illusion. Of course, there are many other hypotheses that would fit the data equally well. So, those were a couple of problems for primitivism. The problem relating to causality and the problem of skeptical hypotheses. We will look at a couple more problems in the next video, but for now, that's all. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.